Your Honor, just for the record, while Ms. Secchi gets settled in there, our understanding was that Mr. Shetler was scheduled to be first up this morning. My understanding from Mr. Taylor is that there was a misunderstanding that when Mr. Shetler's testimony was admitted, that meant he didn't have to be here. We did not waive cross of Mr. Shetler, nor to my knowledge did the board or anybody else. And he should, in the normal course, have to sit for cross with respect to that testimony. That said, it is fairly brief and scant testimony, and we really, in the interest of not slowing things down and not making him have to come back another time, we would waive cross at this time of Mr. Shetler and agree. In my understanding, his testimony was already previously admitted.
Thank you. Are there objections?
Well, no objections, but I also offered on that basis, and not a lot, but a handful of our experts' direct testimony. It's in evidence, so I mean, whatever the objection is, it's frankly meaningless at this point. That testimony is all in evidence, just like any other exhibit is.
Your Honor, that does not necessarily mean that they've been waived for cross. Those are two separate questions. This was my concern when we started admitting testimony out of order, is that traditionally the whole point of pre-filed and the way that the board processes have worked forever is that we don't admit that until the witness actually shows up and sits for cross. And if those witnesses are not going to be made available to be accountable for that testimony, we can certainly move to strike evidence that's already been admitted. Again, unless we waive cross for those witnesses, they still need to anticipate that they're going to show up to be questioned on their testimony, whether it's already been admitted or not.
Okay. Are there objections to waiving testimony for Mr. Shetler? Am I saying the name correctly?
Shetler, yes.
Shetler, okay.
Yeah, Dr. Shetler.
Okay. Okay, with no objections, the board will admit the testimony and exhibits of Mr. Shetler and waive cross-examination. For clarification, Mr. Jorde, were you making a motion to waive testimony for cross for a portion of your expert witnesses?
Well, yes, for every expert that their pre-filed testimony is already in evidence, there's no reason that they would be here. I mean, again, their testimony is in evidence. It's already part of the record. So, I mean, Mr. Dublinski made these objections the first go around. It was overruled that testimony came in over objection. So that ship has sailed.
I disagree, Your Honor. Again, it's a separate question whether or not cross is waived. A lot of testimony has come in. Witnesses are still showing up. They're being cross-examined on that testimony. Those are unrelated matters. Just because testimony is in doesn't mean that we don't have an opportunity to cross-examine that testimony. I have no idea where Mr. Jorde got that idea.
Well, just tell me the rule on cross-examination and this waiver. I'd like to read this rule because it doesn't exist.
It's a long-standing board practice, and it just makes simple sense. We have a process. It's not my problem that Mr. Jorde didn't bother to familiarize himself with those processes. But we pre-filed the testimony. The purpose of the hearing is for cross-examination. And you don't just get out of that without everybody's agreement to it.
But there's no rule.
I don't think we need.
Yeah, there's no rule on that, so.
The motion's been made. We will confer over the lunch hour with the board and make a ruling immediately after lunch. Good morning.
Good morning.
All right. You help me pronounce your last name properly.
It's Secchi, like key.
Secchi, thank you. Go ahead, raise your right hand. Thank you. Do you swear or affirm the testimony you're about to provide is true and accurate?
I do, I swear.
Thank you. Mr. Taylor.
Thank you. Are you the same Silvia Secchi who prepared written testimony in this matter as well as Secchi Direct Exhibit 1?
I am.
And are there any changes or corrections you'd like to make to that testimony?
There aren't any.
Okay. And if I asked you those same questions today, would your answers be substantially the same?
Yes.
Okay. We tender the witness for cross-examination.
Thank you. Mr. Whippel.
Good morning, Ms. Secchi. Have you had a chance at this point to review the rebuttal testimony of Andrew Phillips filed in this matter on October 21st?
I did.
Okay. And in that rebuttal testimony, Mr. Phillips updates the budget and some of the numbers and figures in the economic research performed earlier and described in his direct testimony and sponsored exhibits. Do any of those updates change your assessment or opinion of the economic impacts of the project?
Objection, Your Honor.
State your objection.
The way the process works is that we file testimony, the opponents file responsive testimony, we file rebuttal. The applicant generally gets the last word on that. This is not cross. This is effectively an oral surrebuttal, which is not a proper use of cross-examination. I note that the board on its own website now posts for this week that only truly opposed parties will have an opportunity to cross these witnesses. But using this for oral surrebuttal is just not an appropriate use of the hearing.
Mr. Whippel, did you have a comment, or do you want to?
Well, I would note that perhaps the massive reanalysis engaged in rebuttal testimony effectively precludes any attempt for the other parties to cross-examine or effectively rebut that evidence, and I think Summit knows that and used the rebuttal testimony process pretty effectively to prevent or keep information and even entire witnesses from the other intervening parties. And if we are not allowed to offer counter expert witness testimony at any point, the board will be deprived of the views of experts like Ms. Secchi and what she thinks of the additional evidence entered into the record by Summit.
Your Honor, that is disingenuous. The board generously provided an extra month for discovery. After the rebuttal testimony, they could have formulated these questions for Mr. Phillips. And the fact that they didn't take advantage of having him here for cross does not entitle them to surrebuttal. The rebuttal is supposed to be the last round. And again, we're going to have our expert give direct testimony that is, surrebutting the rebuttal testimony is just not proper.
Oh, okay. We did have a significant change, so in this instance, we're going to overrule. However, we will be keeping this limited. So, go ahead, Mr. Whippel.
Thank you, Your Honor. So I will repeat the question, Ms. Secchi. Does the information contained in the rebuttal testimony change your assessment or opinion of the economic impact of the project?
Well, first of all, let me say that typically in order to do a proper assessment of these documents, you would need the full document, right? And so there were very, very significant changes in terms of the job numbers in the rebuttal, but there wasn't a full report, and there was very cursory language as to why those changes happened. but that was really not enough to for me to say this is a definite, massive change. I think that testimony actually illustrates the problem here, that the experts are completely relying on the numbers that Summit is giving them, and these numbers have not been independently vetted. And we already know from previous studies that these numbers can change on a whim, and they don't most of the time reflect what actually happens on the ground if the pipelines are built. And so I think what that testimony illustrates is that these numbers, as Mr. Phillips noted himself, are not to be used for any planning purposes, and nobody should use them in terms of local government or the Iowa government, because they are not robust numbers. If they change because of a slight delay to that extent, I would be very concerned, even more than I was, about using those numbers for a significant policymaking exercise.
A significant amount of your testimony is directed at the failure of Mr. Phillips to include costs in the plan. Did any of the updates to the plan described in the rebuttal testimony address that part of your direct testimony?
No, and I would also add that, to argue that I didn't do a cost-benefit analysis, I mean, it's not my job to do cost-benefit analysis, but I would argue that since the 1980s under President Reagan, we have used cost-benefit analysis for projects of this size, particularly projects that are argued to be in the public good, where you intend to use eminent domain. And so I would say that basing decisions that impact the livelihood of many people and commit a substantial amount of public funds, just looking at benefit numbers that have not been vetted and okayed by independent experts and completely excluding the costs is not good public policy.
So the tool used by Mr. Phillips in plan, his testimony indicates, is a benefits-only tool. Would you recommend, or is there a better tool that should have been used?
So, in the policymaking process, if you look at the National Environmental Protection Act, the NEPA Act, and you look at how regulatory impact analysis is done, you have to really look at the cost side using a variety of costs, environmental costs, for example, that are pertinent to the case. And also, I would argue that you really need to be critical of the assumptions of models like in-plan, because a lot of these changes are temporary shifts. They are not additions. We are not going to be employing, making more welders. We are just going to shift welders from one job to another for a year or so, or maybe even 6 months, right? So I would say implant can be used and is very often misused, but could be used for a proper cost-benefit, portions of a proper cost-benefit analysis. On the cost side, you really need to involve experts who look at things like the reduction in property values, the loss in yield and associated land values, things like the opportunity costs. That's the other thing. When you do these cost-benefit analysis, you typically have to have meaningful alternatives considered. And I would argue that my main concerns with this project is that nobody is discussing whether this is the best use of public money in order to achieve the goal of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Even from ethanol, the Renewable Fuel Association at the national level had a study that came out last year that actually put carbon capture and sequestration in 5th place when it comes to effectiveness. And they said the best thing we should do is just use more renewables in ethanol plants. And that this doesn't upset landowners. It doesn't have these massive land use changes. And so I would say we need to look at meaningful alternatives to see whether that's a warranted use of public funds. And I have not seen any conversation happening about that, and that is where my concern lies.
Through another witness, Mr. Paroli, Summit has introduced testimony about the ethanol benefits. Have you had a chance to review the study from the Renewable Fuels Association?
Yes, I have looked at that study, and where to begin? I don't want to give you guys a lesson. It's not, we don't have an hour to discuss this. There are a lot of very dramatic assumptions and statements being made. And again, I would refer everybody to what the National Renewable Fuel Association is saying. And the National Renewable Fuel Association is not saying that pipelines are do or die. It's not saying that if we don't build the pipelines, the ethanol industry in Iowa or the region impacted will collapse. What I would say is we know that California is going to stop allowing the sale of internal combustion engines in 2035. And we know that we cannot rely on the low carbon fuel standard subsidies for very long. We know that cars, as we know them, are on their way out, and we need to help farmers off-ramp from corn and ethanol. What this the study is arguing is that, in fact, we need to ramp it up. And so let me give you, I'm Italian, so I'm going to use my hands a little bit, okay? So what we need is a slow decrease, and that's where we should be using that money to help farmers and the ethanol industry move away from current technologies. What they are arguing is that, in fact, we need to ramp it up. What's going to happen is when the situation reaches the point where ethanol is really no longer viable, we've left people without a parachute. And it's irresponsible from my professional perspective to make the argument that, this is absolutely critical. The benefits for farmers are going to be very limited. Ethanol is a very capital-intensive enterprise. The market for corn in Iowa is not going to disappear. We already have plenty of evidence that the government would come to the support of farmers if need be. But it's really, again, not a responsible approach to be so shrill and dramatic in presenting the circumstances we're in.
I believe that's all I have, Your Honor.
Thank you. Mr. Duboinski?
Good morning, Ms. Secchi. Just one question, and I think you touched on this, but just to clarify, you have not provided a study of your own into the record of this case. Is that correct?
No, and I don't think I should, because this is not a matter of, my personal opinion. It's a matter of following a process that is transparent and science-based in order to make massive changes to Iowa's landscape and, deploy and really a lot of public money. So I think that this is not, a me situation. It's a how do we make good policy situation.
So I understand you say it's not a me situation, but bottom line, you did not provide a study, correct?
I did not, and I shouldn't have to.
No further questions.
Mr. Jorde?
Yes, thank you. You're Dr. Secchi, correct?
Yes, but if you're a woman in academia, very often your time is.
Go ahead, Mr. Duboinski.
We went through this last week. The actual opposing party should get to go last. Jorde shouldn't be able to just wait me out and then go behind my...
So I would appreciate that the applicant go last. This one is on me. I did not see Mr. Jorde's card up. That is how we would prefer to proceed. in this case, Mr. Jorde, go ahead and continue with your questions.
And also, for the record, another non-existent rule that Mr. Blinsky likes to make up.
There's a lot.
We're done. We're done.
All right,
We're done. Mr. Jorde, if you want to proceed with your question, please do.
Dr. Secchi, you were asked some questions if you performed a report, but some type of a study, but that wasn't what you were asked to do. Is that right?
No, it wasn't. No.
Okay. And would you agree with me that unreliable inputs produce unreliable outputs?
Indeed, and we have plenty of evidence. The most egregious case for this was the case of the Keystone XL, because in the case of the Keystone XL, the company produced their own study, but then because this required presidential approval, the State Department produced their own study. And when you compare the job numbers, they were 2/3 lower in the State Department independent study. So there is a very long tradition of producing there is a professor at Texas A&M who calls these studies rhetorical devices. They are, PR exercises. Certainly, as the disclaimer on the Ernst & Young says itself, and as the testimony of Mr. Phillips reiterates, you should not use these studies for any policy-making process. So I'm just repeating what they have said multiple times. So.
And would you agree not only that they shouldn't be used for any policy-making process, but that no third party should rely on them, such as the Iowa Utility Board?
That's what they say in the disclaimer. They make it extremely clear they don't want to be held liable. The numbers could be high or low, higher or lower, if I remember correctly the language that Mr. Phillips used.
Now, since July 24th, when you submitted your pre-filed testimony, there's been testimony and rebuttal in this matter, and Summit continues with the refrain that these projects are the savior of ethanol, that it can't survive without it, and they've recently gone on to say it's necessary for the future of agriculture in general. Do you agree or disagree with that?
Again, I would not subject everybody here to a lecture. I would say that as the landowners who have testified have made abundantly clear, the land remains, and the land is the value in Iowa, and we should use it judiciously and protect it for future generations. We shouldn't further extractive processes that rely on public money and are very short-sighted, and we should really be considerate and think about whether that money can be put to better uses. So I would absolutely dispute that, and I think it's a really important point to make, that Iowa is not ethanol. Iowa isn't even corn. We can grow other things, and we will be growing other things as the climate changes. We are still going to be a amazingly important agricultural state. We just need to look forward, not backward.
And the Ernst & Young individual who testified admitted, again, after your deadline for your pre-file testimony, that certain figures were double counted in his report or his adaptation of Summit's documents. Does that concern you?
I mean, I don't put any faith in those numbers to start with. I would not, the only way these numbers should be regarded differently is if we had independent third parties verify them and go line by line regarding the assumptions, where the parts are coming from, where the experts, the construction workers, where people are coming from, how this compares to past projects. The fact that they change is just further proof that you shouldn't be using them.
And did you see any independent verification or peer review on either the Iowa Renewable Fuels Association document or the Ernst & Young report?
No, I think it's because, to be frank, in academia, we don't take these things very seriously. So we know what they're for, and there is no not a lot of scientific value in picking them apart. It's also very difficult because we are not, these are heavily reliant on numbers that Summit gave, right, Ernst & Young. And so if you cannot really access this, typically what you do in academia these days is we have a replication processes, so you make all the raw data available, make all the assumptions very clear. There is repositories where people put this information, and so it's really not a setup that is conducive to doing an independent, thorough analysis to the extent where you can pinpoint all the issues. Like, why are you assuming that so many welders are going to be in Iowa when we compare to the numbers we have, and there are no such welders in Iowa? It would require much more transparency on their part to be able to do this properly.
Would you agree with the Ernst & Young witness for Summit who agreed that unless you take into account the cost of the tax credits to the tune of perhaps $1 billion, $1.5 billion per year, you don't get a true sense of the net benefit, if any, of the project?
So this is the big issue here. It's kind of like the 300-pound gorilla. It's this idea of what we call opportunity cost, right? This project would not exist without public funding. And so first of all, who does this public funded benefit if the pipeline is built? There are about 1,800 ethanol plant workers in Iowa. That's like 0.14% of our labor force. Ethanol is a very, very capital intensive enterprise. And then we're talking about a privately held company. So and even the construction benefits are going to largely go to out-of-state entities. So I would argue that this is really a poor way to generate multipliers, and it's a really poor way to put money into the Iowa economy, okay? I would say that we need to look at alternative ways to spend this hundreds of millions of dollars and really meaningfully also address greenhouse gas emissions from our agricultural system. So that would be my answer.
All right, thank you. I don't have anything further.
Mr. Zeman.
Good morning, ma'am. Something you said caught my attention. You said Iowa isn't corn. Is that fair?
Yes.
How long have you lived in Iowa?
I came here from Europe in 1996. I have 2 children who were born in Iowa. Some of their ancestors are buried in Maquoketa Cemetery. I moved away and lived in Illinois for 8 years, but otherwise I've lived in Iowa all the time I've been in the United States.
That's a great place to live, right?
Yes.
And you drove over here from Iowa City, correct?
Yes.
Did you see any cornfields?
Ready to harvest, a lot of them.
Right. I mean, I guess my point is there's a lot of cornfields, and it's vital for our economy, right?
Yes.
And it likely will be for the long-term future.
Absolutely. What I am arguing is that we need to help farmers diversify and become more resilient, but also we need to consider what's happening elsewhere. So it's been in the news a lot what's happening in California and Arizona, right? They have all these alfalfa production that is very water intensive and it's unsustainable. What is going to happen is that places like Iowa, southern Minnesota, central Illinois, because of our location, because of our productivity, because we have rain-fed agriculture, we are really going to become even more vital to agricultural production. And that's going to require some, there's going to be increases in prices. I'm not saying that this is going to happen by government mandate. The prices are going to shift. And ultimately what's going to happen is that demand for Iowa-made products and Iowa that are associated with Iowa land I foresee it going up, not down. And so that's maybe gonna squeeze corn out in some places, and maybe we're gonna grow more food. Maybe we're gonna have more cattle like we used to do. These changes make this state even more important than it has been, because we are there's plenty of evidence in the literature that places like the Corn Belt are going to be even more important for agriculture and food production.
And are you an economist?
Mr. Zeman, if you could just move your mic a little closer to you. It's a little difficult to hear. Thank you.
I am an economist. I got my PhD at Iowa State in 2000. So don't talk to me about, Cy-Hawk issues, please.
Well, it's fair. If you see my colors, I'm actually a Hawkeye, but I thought they needed a little love after this week. I have no further questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Hayek. Ms. Hayek? Yeah, thank you. Take a pause.
Yes, Chris Hayek, I'm a landowner. I just have a question. Is there anything else you want the board to know as it relates to the CO2 hazardous pipeline project?
I would really urge the board to consider something that we are thinking about a lot in terms of big picture in academia, and it's this idea that pipelines may be necessary to decarbonize some industries, but they should be used extremely, extremely sparingly. And we should consider alternatives that are more cost effective and have more public acceptance. I am not anti-pipelines as a matter of principle. I just think that the process has to be transparent. We need to consider alternatives, and we need to use this sparingly. We can't come back to landowners 2 years from now and say, hey, here's another one. Because this really demeans and degrades, the social fabric of the state. And so whatever we do should be deliberate, should be considerate of private property, and I am particularly concerned that, we are rushing into this without thinking about whether this is viable even in the medium term, and whether there are reasonable alternatives to achieve the result. And I would remind everybody that the goal of 45Q is to help decarbonize the economy. That's the ultimate goal. If there are better ways to do it that don't infringe on private property rights, that don't cause massive environmental costs, we should consider those before we move ahead.
Thank you.
Okay. Mr. Dublinski, and just a quick reminder, your questions are limited to clarification of Mr. Jorde, Mr. Zeman, and Ms. Hayek.
Absolutely. Ms. Secchi, that last answer you gave Ms. Hayek about 45Qs we ought to look at alternatives. None of those things you listed are actually in any of the rules regarding the use of 45Qs today, correct?
Well, you can be literal in your interpretation of things, or you can look at the big picture.
And I'm asking, are there any rules?
No, there aren't.
No further questions.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Taylor, the redirect? Oh, one board question. Okay, go ahead.
Ms. Secchi, I just want to clarify a few things that you mentioned. So one of the things you referenced it multiple times, but you kept using the phrase public money. Can you please clarify what you mean by public money?
Well, these pipelines are heavily, they wouldn't exist without funding that comes from the federal government, right? The goal of the economic feasibility relies on the 45Q provision in the tax code. And so the the various estimates I've seen from the companies themselves are in the range of hundreds of millions of dollars in the value of captured carbon. There's three main sources of revenue that the companies are considering. The principal one is these provisions in the tax code, the 45Q provision. They're also banking on being able to sell the ethanol at a higher price to places like California because it will have lower carbon intensity. That is it's being heavily used by California now, but it's on its way out, right? Because California is really pushing for decarbonization, and so that demand for that lower carbon intensity ethanol is going away. And then the third source that companies are arguing, the third source of revenue that companies are arguing they are going to have come in is I think it's very problematic. That would be the only non-public money source. They are planning on selling offsets in the voluntary carbon market. I would argue that that is double dipping. If we've already paid for that carbon to be sequestered, they can't sell the value of that carbon in the private market because that's double counting. And so, but there is nothing now in the books that says they cannot do it. So these are the three sources of revenue, and two are coming from public funds, essentially.
Then you, excuse me, one of the things you talked about was using the public money as a parachute. And then you made a comment that government would come to the need or help of farmers. Can you expand on what do you mean by that?
Well, just look at what happened with the emergency payments during the trade wars, right? We know that when things reach a pretty dramatic point, like the loss of an important export market, the government is very likely to come to the help of farmers, which have been left holding the bag, if you will, through no fault of their own. And so here it would be, what I'm thinking is if there is an emergency, the government comes to the rescue, but that's not really a sustainable solution, right? If the ethanol market at some point becomes non-viable, there are going to be, there's going to be help for farmers, but, we did this already in the 1980s, right? There was a farm crisis, and in the 1985 Farm Bill, and then, every time there has been a crisis, there has been help to farmers. What I'm arguing is that help is not the best way to plan, right? Ex post facto emergency payments are not a substitute for long-term planning and promoting a vibrant, sustainable economy. So I would say that I'm not worried that, no government funding will come, but I would argue that we should be planning for ways to use that government funding efficiently and effectively.
So then, I'm just trying to clarify all this. So, in your interpretation, do you see the 45Q tax credit as a mechanism to help farmers?
I think that the 45Q tax credit is a way to help the ethanol industry, which is not a way to necessarily help farmers. It may help maintain things the way they are for a longer period of time, but it may also make changes more difficult. I would like to remind everybody that before the 2007 energy bill, right, when we had the ethanol mandate, we were growing less corn in Iowa. And the energy bill essentially, and the mandate, made us produce even more corn. We lost Conservation Reserve Program land. We went from a lot of corn-soybean rotations to continuous corn. So it was a policy that made us go further into this. And now I'm arguing that we need policies that help us bring us back to that corn soybean rotation, maybe some small grains, maybe some cattle in pasture. We don't need policies that further entrench the system we have, because we already know that this system is date limited. We are going to be driving electric cars, and we are not going to be using so much ethanol in the future.
So, as an economist, what has been the economic impact of the ethanol industry to Iowa?
Well, I think, if I had a map, I'm also a geographer. If I had a map, I would show you the census changes from 2010 to 2020. Most Iowa rural counties have lost population. The fact of the matter is that, as I said, ethanol is a very capital intensive industry. It doesn't create lots of local jobs. And so we have not, what I would argue is that we need shifts that produce more local jobs in agriculture and value added, right? Things like more small slaughterhouses, smaller food hubs, bringing back activities that are more labor intensive and produce value added for our economy. I would argue that the impact of ethanol in the Iowa economy has largely been that our land prices have gone up, but it really hasn't done much in terms of rural employment and rural employment opportunities. And you can see that in the numbers of people still moving away from rural counties.
And just, and have you done any research on this, that without that ethanol industry, the decline could have been faster?
Well, okay. So without that ethanol industry and the same amount of subsidies that we have injected into, until 2012, corn ethanol received subsidies directly, right? And then we have all the subsidies that corn reduces, that the corn brings in from the Farm Bill. We're talking about, this is pure speculation, but I would argue that there were better ways to put that money to use. That was a lot of money. Iowa is the biggest recipient of federal funding from the Farm Bill, and I would argue that just putting it into corn and corn ethanol is, ethanol, corn production itself is not very labor intensive, right? You can farm 3,000 acres by yourself. It's become a very capital intensive enterprise. I would argue that if we wanted to have more job creation, more rural development, we should have diversified and not put all our eggs in the corn basket. And that's a big problem we have in the Corn Belt.
And just to expand on that, so what would have been a better use? Where would you have put those funds?
Well, I would say that we're doing some things in that direction, but still not enough. So, for example, the crop insurance program, we don't have whole farm crop insurance very well developed. And so if we had whole farm crop insurance, we wouldn't be giving such preferential treatment to corn and soybeans, right? So you would help farmers who want to diversify. If we had put this money into things like helping beginning farmers more than we are, right? We're starting to do some of these things, but the bulk of the money still goes to large-scale producers. I mean, there's analysis of that most of the subsidies go to a small portion of producers, which are the largest ones. And so there's really no, there's no spreading that wealth, if you will.
So those two are the two main.
Well, these are policy tools. If you gave me more latitude, I would say we could change the way we do school lunches. We I believe it was just proposed to eliminate the local foods board, right? We could expand on production of local foods. We could provide incentives for farms that diversify much more than we do now, right? Farms that pasture animals, farms that produce oats or small grains. There's all sorts of things that we could do that we're not doing.
All right, I think I'll stop there because otherwise we can have a really long conversation. So, all right, thank you.
Hi, Dr. Secchi. Just a couple more questions to kind of restate what I think you've said, and correct me if I'm wrong. In your mind, the ethanol industry will or should kind of fade away or go away in the near or midterm. Is that correct?
We can have a discussion about what is the near or midterm. I don't think that the ethanol industry is going away in the near term. I would say in the next 25 years, the landscape is going to look remarkably different. So in California this year, 1/4 of the cars they're selling are EVs, right? And we can certainly have a lot of the speed of these things depends on who is the president, and I'm going to stop at that. And so there could be a longer period where we try to maintain things the way they are, or this could speed up as we take the lead from California faster. But it's pretty clear that ethanol is a complement, not a substitute for the internal combustion, for gasoline, right? Because we are using 1/3 of the U.S. corn crop to produce 6%, according to the numbers that I've seen, of our transportation fuel demand. So this is not scalable. We can't just use all our cropland in America to grow ethanol, right? So the faith of the ethanol industry is linked to the faith of internal combustion engine cars. The faster they go.
Specifically gasoline powered vehicles.
Yes, and so the faster they go, the faster ethanol will. Diesel has never been because of just the way that the history happened in America, has never been as big a deal as ethanol.
And so that kind of goes with the assumption that, give or take, depending on where policy goes and everything, that the U.S. or the world will transition to EVs or other type of fuels. Is that correct?
Yes. And maybe I should have made this point clearer. In Iowa, we are incredibly well positioned to do well there, right? Iowa is the biggest producer of wind energy percentage-wise in electricity generation in the country. We have a lot of potential for solar energy. There's research being done now at Iowa State on agrivoltaics, so where we can grow crops or graze animals under solar panels. So I think that's what I'm thinking in terms of transition in a way that is, not painful and doesn't come as a cliff for Iowa's agriculture.
And so, to you, that medium-term outlook for the ethanol industry does not justify this project. Is that correct in your assessment?
That's, I as I said, I have not produced a full-blown study, but in my professional opinion, just looking at how things are moving in California, looking at how things are moving international, looking at how the car industry, with all its troubles, right, is positioning itself for the future. That's what I would say.
In a hypothetical here, if you did think that ethanol were kind of a viable future solution, would you be supportive of a similar type project?
Well, I started writing on the environmental impacts of ethanol as soon as the RFS was passed. And I think for Iowa's environment, ethanol has not been good. The papers that we wrote in 2009, 2011 are now being confirmed in terms of the effects of ethanol. I think ethanol, as Monty Shaw himself said in 2005, I think it was, ethanol is a bridge technology. And it was a bridge technology to get to cellulosic. Cellulosic didn't happen. We shouldn't be, continuing on a road that has demonstrated not to be viable. We've seen much higher uptake and much more technological development when it comes to electric vehicles. This is making this technology even more obsolete, and it wasn't really a good technology to start with.
Thank you. No further questions.
Thank you for your questions. Another one? Just limited to clarification on Board Member Bird's.
Okay. Just for the record, you mentioned a name. I believe you said Monty Shaw.
Yes.
Okay, and who's Monty Shaw?
I believe Mr. Shaw is has or had a leadership position with the Iowa Renewable Fuel Association, and before the renewable fuel standard, the second renewable fuel standard was passed, there was an agreement in the industry and with all stakeholders that corn ethanol was the bridge that would take us to cellulosic. I want to remind everybody that the 15 billion gallons in the renewable fuel standard is a ceiling, not a floor. So we were going to cap the production of corn ethanol to 15 billion gallons, and we were going to expand the production of cellulosic ethanol to 16 billion gallons. That was the goal of the RFS. That never materialized. Every year we've had a mandate for cellulosic ethanol. We have not met it. We're supposed to be at 16 billion gallons of production today, and we are below 1 billion gallons. So I would say that we shouldn't be rewriting history. We all agreed that ethanol was going to take us to a different technology, and now we're arguing that ethanol is the different technology, and that was not the contract we made when we passed the energy bill in 2007.
So in looking back in my notes, one of the things that did get brought up, and I apologize, I don't remember who or what, but I know it got brought up a couple times, was sustainable aviation fuel as a product of ethanol. So we've talked a lot about electric cars, and I have no idea if we're getting to electric planes. I think I might be hesitant on that one, but is that something that should enter into this equation?
I think this is a very contested space as to whether corn ethanol is really a sustainable aviation fuel, and you would have a lot of people tell you that that's not the case, and particularly if we're talking in the international arena, people would really not take kindly to that kind of assertion, and I mean, from my perspective, this is the next cellulosic ethanol is the next bridge that we're not going to cross, but we're going to tell us that we're going to cross so we can keep using corn ethanol. So for the things that we have been using. But I would say if that's the way the industry wants to go, we certainly don't need the mandate anymore, right? We can get rid of the mandate, and I don't see the industry arguing for that at all. I see them arguing that we should keep it and, in fact, increase, from E10 to E15 year-round and things like that. So from their actions, I don't think that they see this as a viable alternative, at least in the near to medium future.
Thank you.
Mr. Taylor, for redirect.
No redirect, but we would, for the record, offer into evidence Silvia Secchi's written direct testimony and Secchi direct exhibit 1.
Thank you. Are there objections?
No
Seeing no objections, the board will admit the evidence and give it the weight due. Thank you. Appreciate it. Okay.
And that completes the club's evidence.
Thank you.